Viola Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo was a civil rights activist who was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan as she drove another activist from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama during the Selma voting rights march. Born Viola Gregg in Pennsylvania on April 11, 1925, she was raised in poverty in Georgia and Tennessee during the Great Depression, where she witnessed segregation firsthand. She later moved to Michigan, married Teamster Anthony Liuzzo in 1950, and attended Wayne State University, and around the same time became active in the Detroit chapter of the NAACP. A middle-class white mother of 5 children, Liuzzo was later compelled to join the voting rights Selma to Montgomery marches after seeing televised footage of hundreds of peaceful protesters being clubbed and tear-gassed by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7, 1965. So she drove her Oldsmobile 800 miles to Selma, where more than 8,000 people had gathered to take part in protests, and commenced the marches to Montgomery. By the end of the march, the 8,000 number had swelled to more than 25,000 people, thanks to people who joined along the way. Now, after the march concluded on March 25th, Liuzzo, assisted by Leroy Martin, a 19-year-old African-American man, offered to be among those that transported marchers and volunteers from Montgomery back to Selma in their cars. She had been warned by civil rights activist James Orange that this would be dangerous, but she insisted in doing her part. After dropping passengers in Selma, she and Morton headed back to Montgomery, but when Liuzzo stopped at a red light, a car with 4 members of the local Ku Klux Klan pulled up alongside her. These Klansmen were enraged to see a white woman and a black man in a car together, so they followed Liuzzo as she tried to outrun them, but they eventually managed to overtake her Oldsmobile. When Liuzzo still wouldn't comply and pulled over, they sprayed bullets on the car indiscriminately, fatally shooting her twice in the head, after which the car veered into a ditch, crashing into a fence. Now, although Morton was covered with Liuzzo's blood, the bullets missed him, and he lay motionless when the Klansmen reached the car to check on their victims. After the Klansmen left, Morton began searching for help and eventually flagged down a truck driven by Reverend Leon Riley, who, like Morton and Liuzzo, was transporting civil rights workers back to Selma. Within 24 hours of the murder, President Lyndon Johnson went on television to announce the arrest of the KKK members who were involved. These included Eugene Thomas, Colin Leroy, William Orville Eaton, and Gary Thomas Roy. He also demanded an immediate congregational investigation of the KKK. Unfortunately, Roy was protected by the FBI because he was one of its paid informants and testified against the other men. But in an unsurprising turn of events, the KKK members were all acquitted in the Alabama courts, despite eyewitness testimony and ballistics evidence. Luckily, on the other hand, they were found guilty of violating Viola Liuzzo's civil rights by a federal grand jury and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Liuzzo's funeral in Detroit was attended by many dignitaries, including Dr. Martin Luther King and Walter Reuther. Now, in line with the American government's racist attitude at the time, they wouldn't let the idea that even white women could be targets of white supremacy marinate in the minds of people. Immediately after her burial, her reputation was slandered as false accusations were made about her morality, dedication to her family, and drug use. And this smear campaign was masterminded by none other than FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was exposed in 1978 thanks to documents released following the Freedom of Information Act. He spread rumors that Liuzzo was a member of the Communist Party and had abandoned her children to have sexual relationships with African Americans involved in the civil rights movement. And why did the monster do all this? Well, he admitted he was fearful of people blaming the FBI for their informants' involvement in the murder. And thanks to Hoover's smear campaign, Liuzzo's children were threatened and taunted, and a cross was burned on their lawn, prompting the need of round-the-clock guard for the next 2 years. Fortunately though, her death was not in vain. Her death, among many others, are what helped spark the passing of the Voting Rights Act just 5 months later. Viola Liuzzo also received many posthumous awards, including the prestigious Ford Freedom Humanitarian Award, and in 2015, Wayne State University awarded her an honorary Doctor of Laws degree, its first posthumous grant. John Brown. John Brown is arguably the most important white figure in the struggle against slavery immediately before the Civil War. Born in Torrington, Connecticut, into a family of deeply religious Congregationalists who were Puritan in their heritage and overly anti-slavery in their views, it's obvious Brown grew up in an atmosphere in which everyone despised slavery. Both Brown and his father were early supporters of the new abolitionism that emerged in the 1830s. Brown's father, a prominent businessman with a large tannery, was involved in trying to make Western Reserve College into an anti-slavery stronghold. When that failed, the elder Brown supported the creation of Oberlin College as a racially integrated co-educational institution of higher learning with an anti-slavery focus. Now, fast forward to the 1850s when we find John Brown, who by this point is participating in the Underground Railroad and in 1851 helped found the League of Gileadites, an organization of whites, free blacks, and runaway slaves dedicated to protecting fugitive slaves from slave catchers. As John Brown's anti-slavery commitments continued to deepen, he came up with a plan to engage in guerrilla war tactics against slavery. Up until this point, this plan was unlike any other, organized by a white man, attended largely by blacks, and designed to trigger an anti-slavery revolution that would wipe out the practice across the United States. In line with his plan, Brown made headlines in December 1858 when he invaded Missouri, where he killed a slave owner, liberated 11 slaves, and brilliantly evaded law enforcement officers as he led the freed blacks to Canada. Even more impressive, although a wanted man with a price of $250 on his head, Brown returned to the United States, traveling and speaking in Ohio, New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And in July 1859, Brown visited his home in North Elba, New York for the last time, where he said goodbye to his wife and daughters. Brown at this point probably knew that he was unlikely to see his family again, something he stoically accepted as a cost of his crusade against slavery. A month later, Brown and his sons Oliver and Owen arrived in Harper's Ferry on July 3, 1859, where Brown rented a farm in Maryland and started planning future raids. He expected that after word of his plan got out, large numbers of men would come to enlist in his army, but by September, only 18 had arrived, including another of Brown's sons, Watson. By mid-October, a few more arrived, and on Sunday, October 16, Brown and his men began their raid. The group was made up of a strange assortment: veterans of the struggles in Kansas, fugitive slaves, free blacks, transcendental idealists, Oberlin college men, and youthful abolitionists on their first foray into the world. The youngest was 18, and the oldest, Dangerfield Newby, was a 44-year-old fugitive slave from Virginia who hoped to rescue his wife from bondage. But most of the raiders were in their 20s, half of the age of the leader, the 59-year-old John Brown. Brown left 3 of his recruits to guard their supplies and arms at the farmhouse in Maryland. The remaining 18 raiders, 13 whites and 5 blacks, marched with John Brown to Harper's Ferry. Brown's small army arrived in Harper's Ferry at night, where they quickly and swiftly secured the federal armory and arsenal, and later Hall's Rifles Works, the site that manufactured weapons for the national government. Now here is the part that Brown miscalculated. With the telegraph wires cut, Brown could have easily seized the weapons in the town, liberated slaves in the neighborhood, and then taken to the hills. Or he might have just destroyed the armory and literally blown up the town before running away. Strangely, however, he remained in the armory, waiting for slaves to flock to his standard, but they never came. Instead, townsmen and farmers soon surrounded the armory, and even though these civilians were not strong enough to take on John Brown, they kept him pinned down long enough for the US military to get there. President James Buchanan had already dispatched US Marines and soldiers to Harper's Ferry, and on the morning of October 18, Marines stormed the engine house of the armory, capturing Brown and a few of his raiders and killing the rest. By the end of the raid, of the 22 who had been involved in the plot, 10 of Brown's men, including sons Watson and Oliver, were dead or mortally wounded, and 5, including Brown, had been captured. 7 escaped, but 2 were later captured in Pennsylvania and returned to Virginia for the trial and execution. The other 5, including Brown's son Owen, made their way to safe havens in Canada and remote parts of the North. 10 days after his capture, Brown's trial began in Charlestown, Virginia, now West Virginia, where he was charged with treason, murder, and conspiring with slaves to rebel. He was then convicted on November 2nd and sentenced to death. But before his sentencing, Brown told the court that his action against slavery were consistent with God's commandment. "I believe," he said in a speech that electrified many Northerners, "that to have interfered as I have in behalf of his despised poor is no wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, then I say, let it be done." When Brown was hanged in 1859 for his raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, many saw him as the harbinger of the future. For Southerners, he was the embodiment of all their fears and the worst possible nightmare, a fearless, committed white abolitionist, armed, accompanied by blacks, and willing to die to end slavery. He was also the most powerful symbol of aggressive Northern anti-slavery sentiment up until that point. And for many Northerners and black people, he was a prophet of righteousness, bringing down a terrible swift sword against the immorality of slavery and the arrogance of the Southern master class. Even Frederick Douglass would later say that while he lived for the slave, John Brown was willing to die for the slave. By the time of John's execution, the entire nation was fixated on this bearded man who spoke and looked like a biblical prophet and whose deeds thrilled, whether with fear or admiration or both, an entire generation. Eleanor Roosevelt. Back in the 1920s, 30s and so forth, the Howard University's music department had an annual music series that usually invited someone famous every year to come and perform in Washington. In 1939, they chose Marian Anderson, an African-American opera singer who had been hailed by many in the industry as being a one-in-a-million voice. Since a lot of people anticipated this show, Howard University had no choice but to search for a larger avenue that could accommodate everyone. So in January 1939, Howard University petitioned the Daughters of the American Revolution to use the Washington DC auditorium called Constitution Hall for the concert, which had been scheduled to be over Easter weekend that year. Constitution Hall was built in the 1920s to house the DAR's national headquarters and host its national conventions. It seated 4,000 people and was the largest auditorium in the capital. As such, it was the center for the city's fine arts and music events. Now, the Daughters of the American Revolution, unsurprisingly, said no because they had an unwritten white performers only policy. And despite pressure from the press, other great artists, politicians, and a new organization called the Marian Anderson Citizens Committee, the DAR held fast and continued to deny Anderson use of the hall. As the controversy grew, however, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution herself, decided to take a stand. Right away, she addressed the issue in her My Day column, which was published in newspapers across the country at the time, where she vehemently denounced the decision by the DAR and announced her resignation from the organization, effective immediately. In her letter to the DAR, Roosevelt wrote, "I am in complete disagreement with the attitude taken in refusing Constitution Hall to such a great artist. You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and it seems to me that your organization has failed." She added, "To remain as a member implies approval of that action, therefore I am resigning." And that wasn't it. She decided to do something even more grandiose. When the King and Queen of England visited United States that year, she invited Anderson to perform at the White House and also personally presented the Spin Gun Medal to Marian Anderson at the 1939 National Convention of the NAACP. Hold on, that wasn't all she did. At Eleanor Roosevelt's behest, President Roosevelt and Walter White, then executive secretary of the NAACP, and Anderson's manager, Sol Hurok, arranged an open-air concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The event attracted a crowd of more than 75,000 people, in addition to a national radio audience of millions across the country. Now, you'd be mistaken to think that's as far as Mrs. Roosevelt's allyship extends. After her inspections of the New Deal programs in the southern states, she concluded that the programs which had been enacted to help the poor were discriminating against African Americans who received a disproportionately small share of the relief money. Roosevelt became one of the only voices in her husband's administration, insisting that benefits be equally extended to Americans of all races. Roosevelt also broke with tradition by inviting hundreds of African American guests to the White House. And in 1936, she became aware of the conditions at the National Training School for Girls, a predominantly black reform school in Washington, D.C. She visited the school, wrote about it in her My Day column, lobbied for additional funding, and pressed for changes in staffing and curriculum in the school. Roosevelt also arranged the appointment of African-American educator Mary Bethune, with whom she had struck up a friendship, as director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. To avoid problems with the government staff when Mary would visit the White House, Roosevelt would always meet her at the gate, embrace her, and walk in with her arm in arm. And by the way, Eleanor Roosevelt, in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, not only supported it, she was relentless, and she wanted everyone to know where she stood, that she wanted it implemented. In the end, Roosevelt's support of African American rights made her an unpopular figure among whites in the South. Rumor even spread of Eleanor clubs formed by servants to oppose the employees, and Eleanor Tuesdays, on which African American men would knock down white women on the street. No evidence has ever been found of either practices, by the way. Even more importantly, when the race riots broke out in Detroit in June 1943, critics in both the North and South wrote that Roosevelt was to blame, as she had vehemently pushed for the introduction of blacks into the Sojourner Truth Housing Project in Detroit. Her support pushed the immigrant Polish community in Detroit to stage an uprising against black people, which later culminated in the Detroit race riots of 1943. In the wake of these attacks, critics of Miss Roosevelt accused her of being a communist and demanded that the FBI take action on her. And of course, the FBI didn't need any encouragement under, wait for it, J. Edgar Hoover. Yeah, the same Hoover that specially targeted Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and Viola Liuzzo in an effort to assassinate their characters by spreading false rumors. J. Edgar Hoover, according to one researcher, said that Mrs. Roosevelt must have had some Negro blood in her. That's actually funny considering J. Edgar Hoover's grandparents and great-grandparents were black people. Anyway, none of these deterred the First Lady. In the end, the FBI was anti-Eleanor Roosevelt, investigated her over and over, and she knew it, but she held her ground. And the more they fought against her, the more she became sensitized to the plight of black people. It's important to point out that Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't a perfect ally, as she usually refrained from giving her support anytime the civil rights movement adopted quote-unquote radical stances such as the March on Washington in 1941. However, there is no denying that she went above and beyond the national standard at the time in support of black people, women, and all other minorities. William Moore. In April 1963, William Moore, a white civil rights activist, had saved up enough vacation days that he decided to use to take a civil rights-inspired journey. He planned to walk from Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, to hand-deliver a letter to Mississippi's Governor Ross Barnett, urging Ross to rethink racist state policies and support integration. William was a Baltimore postal worker who had a history of activism, fighting for the rights of black people and those with mental illness, according to the reporting by the Baltimore Sun. A former Marine, Moore was also a member of the Congress of Racial Equality and had participated in a number of their protests. Now, on April 21, Moore arrived by bus in Chattanooga, where he began what he thought would be a 400-mile trip, often barefoot. Moore wore a sandwich board that read on one side, "And segregation in America, black or white, eat at Joe's," and on the other read, "Equal rights for all, Mississippi or bust." Needless to say, his one-man protest attracted local media coverage and curiosity of residents in every town he passed through. And on April 23, 1963, about 70 miles and 3 days into his march, Moore was interviewed by Charles Hicks, a reporter from a local radio station in Gadsden. The station had received an anonymous phone tip about Moore's location earlier that day. In the interview, Moore told Hicks that, "I intend to walk right up to the governor's mansion in Mississippi and ring his doorbell. Then I'll hand him my letter." He hoped the letter would urge the governor to support integration. Now, after the interview, Hicks was understandably concerned for William's safety, so he offered to drive into a motel. William, however, insisted on continuing his one-man march. Unfortunately, that will be the last time anyone saw William alive. Less than an hour after the reporter left the scene, a passing motorist found Moore's body about a mile further down the road, where he had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The rifle was later found to belong to Floyd Simpson, a white Alabamian. Simpson was arrested but never indicted for Moore's murder. And when activists from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Co attempted to finish William's march using the same route, they were beaten and arrested by Alabama state troopers. Freedom Riders. Since Jim Crow laws were instituted toward the end of the 19th century, African Americans in the South were forced to endure substandard, racially segregated conditions. Black travelers were forced to sit at the back of the bus and use separate waiting rooms, restrooms, and drinking fountains. Thankfully though, legal battles to end segregation in public facilities yielded some success in the 1960s. But still, as you'd expect, many Southern states resisted compliance with court-ordered integration. One of these legal battles was Boynton versus Virginia, which outlawed segregation in interstate public facilities. On May 4, 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality began an effort where black men and white activists agreed to ride together through the South on Greyhound and Trailway buses to test whether the buses and transport facilities were complying with the decision in Boynton vs. Virginia. Now, as you'd expect, these freedom fighters were met with extreme violence by local whites, who banned the Raiders bus in Anniston, Alabama, and attacked freedom riders in Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama. In fact, when they reached Anniston, Alabama on May 14, Mother's Day, they were met by an angry mob, and local officials had given the Ku Klux Klan permission to attack the riders without any consequences. The first bus was firebombed outside Anniston while the white mob held the doors closed to lock in the passengers, and any passengers that successfully made their way through were beaten senselessly by the mobs. Anyway, were the raids a success? Yes, they were. The attacks received widespread attention in the news media, and on May 29, 1961, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation in all interstate bus travels. The order, which was issued on September 22nd and went into effect on November 1st, led to the removal of Jim Crow signs from stations, waiting rooms, water fountains, and restrooms in bus terminals. Stay tuned for the final part.